Well, welcome everyone to the Walton Center for Planetary Health, home of the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. I'm Mickey Kittleson, Vice Dean in the College of Global Futures and Professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies. Global Futures here is rooted in the conviction that we can and should make a meaningful contribution to ensuring a habitable planet and a future in which well-being is attainable for all humankind. Shaping peaceful, economically vibrant, and just global futures depends on the coherence of the global order. As we're all too well aware, we're living in a world of increasing polarization. Events taking place around the world continue to threaten security, human rights, and our shared futures. And at the same time, we're witnessing urgent threats to the systems that support our planet, including climate change. Those dynamics exacerbate challenges such as destabilized and increasingly autocratic political systems, food and water insecurity, forced migration, and conflict. And those things often disproportionately affect the most vulnerable groups in societies. To quote General McMaster's foreign policy article, in today's interconnected world, threats do not remain confined to particular regions. Multilateral institutions like the UN, NATO, World Trade Organization, European Union, they formed the basis of the post-war global order. And today they have unprecedented challenges. How can we at ASU meaningfully address this? Well, together, Craig Calhoun, Ben Hurlbut, Henry Thompson, and I have started organizing efforts, collective efforts, to connect scholars across ASU around themes of how geopolitical change shapes global futures. So if you're interested in participating in our future events or discussions, please send me a note after this and we'll add you to our growing network. Today's event, Global Disorder, the Need to Build Strategic Competence to Restore Peace, Promote Prosperity, and Secure a Better Future, will examine critical foreign policy, address national and international security challenges, and discuss what's needed to secure peace and prosperity for future generations. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Global Futures Laboratory, the School of Politics and Global Studies, the Future Security Initiative, and the Center for Constitutional Design. I'd like to also thank you, many thanks to Carolyn Forbes, Michelle Oldfield, and Elva Guemes for coordinating the event. So we're going to begin, this is the order of our event, we're going to begin with remarks from General McMaster from the podium, and then we're going to move to a roundtable. So after that, we'll bring up our three esteemed panelists from ASU for a discussion. Each panelist will talk a little bit about General McMaster's remarks, and then we'll have some question and answer from the audience. So we are absolutely delighted to have Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, U.S. Army, an ASU Distinguished University Fellow, joining us today. General McMaster is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a lecturer at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. He was the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Upon graduation from the U.S. Military Academy in 1984, McMaster served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years before retiring as Lieutenant General in June of 2018. From 2014 to 2017, McMaster designed the future Army as Director of the Army Capabilities Integration. General McMaster holds a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was an assistant professor of history at the United States Military Academy from 1994 to 1996. He's the author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, and also of the award-winning book Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. His many essays, articles, book reviews on leadership, history, and the future of warfare. They've appeared in outlets such as The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs. With all of that, please welcome General McMaster to the podium.
When we see our world in so much trouble, and I think the theme of today's talk is strategic competence. How do we increase our strategic competence, which I would define as the ability to integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to accomplish well-defined goals and objectives, and to make the world a better place. And in this case, I think to restore peace and promote prosperity. And so what I thought I would do initially here is just share with you a few thoughts I jotted down on the way out here about what's going on in our world today. And I think what's missing is an appreciation for the degree to which the many conflicts that we're witnessing are connected to one another. And when we don't pay attention to those connections, we miss opportunities, I think, to restore peace and to counter what I would call the axis of aggressors who we are confronting today. So we're bearing witness to these cascading crises, as I would describe them, because I believe they are cascading. I believe if we don't improve our strategic competence, they're going to cascade further, probably into the Indo-Pacific region. And they're stretching obviously from Ukraine to across the Middle East. And we're contemplating looming crises, as I mentioned, in the South China Sea, to the Taiwan Strait, to the Senkakus and Ryukyus Islands, to the Korean Peninsula. And most of us do tend to look at these conflicts and potential conflicts discreetly. And that's a problem because, as I mentioned, it leads, I think, to missed opportunities to counter aggression, to resolve ongoing conflicts, and prevent violence from spreading to other theaters. It's important to remember that just before Russia's unprovoked reinvasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, President Vladimir Putin and Chairman Xi Jinping issued a joint statement prior to the Beijing Olympics, in which they celebrated their partnership with no limits, and they announced a new era of international relations. I mean, the message was, hey, Western world, United States, you're over, you're finished. It's our era now, and we're in charge. Consider how after nations around the world imposed sanctions on Russia, Moscow deepened its dependence on Beijing for purchases of oil and gas necessary for the cash needed to sustain its war-making machine, and also for the hardware and components necessary to sustain its onslaught against the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian infrastructure. In addition to this financial and material support, Beijing's diplomats and wolf warriors have amplified the Kremlin's propaganda and misinformation to justify its special military operation as somehow a war against NATO aggression or a war to denazify a country led by a Russian-speaking Jewish president. But the many connections across today's conflicts extend far beyond the Moscow-Beijing cooperation on Ukraine. The Russian-Iranian-Syrian axis has enabled serial episodes of mass homicide in the Syrian civil war, killing or displacing half of that population and putting pressure on neighboring countries as well as on Europe. Russia has helped Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps perpetuate not only that civil war in Syria, but also sectarian civil wars across the Middle East to help Iran keep the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict while it extends its influence across the region and establishes essentially a land bridge to the Mediterranean. The Islamic Republic of Iran returned the favor by enabling Russia's onslaught against Ukraine's people and its infrastructure through the export of Tehran's missile and drone complex. And of course, not to be left out, North Korea provided Russia with over 1 million artillery rounds, likely in exchange for help with Pyongyang's missile and nuclear weapons programs and support for Kim Jong-un's recent intensification of threats to South Korea and security in Northeast Asia, including, of course, the resumption of intercontinental ballistic missile tests just in recent months. And all of that mutual support predated Hamas's mass murder attacks of October 7th, 2023, which included heinous acts of infanticide, rape, torture, and kidnapping. Iran helped Hamas an organization that shares Tehran's professed intention to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews, build its terrorist infrastructure and capabilities, as well as plan and prepare that assault. Russian support for Hamas went beyond Russian arms, such as the Kornet missiles that have been found under hospitals in Gaza. Putin seemed to take October 7th as a present for his 71st birthday. He has used the crisis to intensify his missile and drone attacks on Ukraine, launch a new propaganda campaign against the United States, and curry favor with other nations through a pro-Palestinian stance after having supported the organization that diverted international assistance into terrorism, used the Palestinian people as human shields, and provoked a war they knew would result in the death and displacement of the Palestinian population in Gaza. It is worth noting, I think, at this point, that none of the tunnels underneath Gaza are available to the civilian population for shelter. As a call for a ceasefire in Gaza, Moscow assumed the dual roles that it has been playing alongside Iran in Syria, arsonist and fireman. Moscow, the arsonist, enables Tehran as it activates its so-called axis of resistance. That axis is really an offensive network of proxy armies and terrorist organizations from Iraq to Yemen to Syria to Lebanon to the West Bank to Gaza. Iran's cynical strategy is to expend as many Arab lives as it takes in pursuit of its ambitions to push the United States out of the Middle East, subjugate its Arab neighbors, and destroy Israel. As the arsonist helps Iran keep the Middle East in flames, Moscow, the fireman, offers to help put out the fires through mediation and moderation of Tehran's ambitions. Xi Jinping, on his side, entered into a strategic partnership with Tehran and is buying more Iranian oil and providing cover to Iran diplomatically as well. Just 5 days ago, the communist dictator in Beijing welcomed President Raisi, appropriately, on Valentine's Day. The Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, Pyongyang axis members are already working together. And I think it is reasonable to assume, at the very least, that they will take advantage of the world's preoccupation with a crisis in one area to accelerate the achievement of their goals in another. As Xi Jinping has said, the most important characteristic of the world is, in a word, chaos. But Beijing seems to have concluded that chaos redounds to its benefit and is consistent with Xi's belief that the times and trends are on our side. The call to integrate the China dream and the world dream are not just words. The CCP has recently published a white paper that describes how the party intends to achieve that vision through 4 programs. The Belt and Road, with which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and, scarier still, the Global Civilization Initiative. Xi Jinping's statements, the massive buildup of the People's Liberation Army, and acts of aggression against Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and India all indicate that Xi is prepared to use force to achieve his dream to subsume Taiwan, follow through on his claim of ownership of the ocean in the South China Sea, and create an exclusionary area of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region. So that is why defeating Russia in Ukraine and Iran's terrorist network across the Middle East are important objectives on their own, but they're also vital to preventing another disastrous war. The perception of Russia's success in Ukraine or Iran's in the Middle East would encourage aggression by the 2 other members of the Axis, Beijing and Pyongyang. Xi Jinping might conclude that, hey, it's time to lash out against what he has called the all-around containment, encirclement, and suppression against us. That sounds to me like an echo of Putin's claims that NATO or Ukrainian Nazis posed a threat to Russia. So supporting Ukraine's effort to defeat the Russian invaders, reestablish security, rebuild, and develop a long-term ability to defend its sovereignty against future attacks is vital to the Indo-Pacific region and peace broadly. And supporting an outcome in the Israel-Hamas war and the broader regional conflict in the Middle East that includes the defeat of Hamas and other members of Iran's terrorist network is also important to convincing Xi Jinping that the United States and its partners possess the will and the capability to respond to aggression and support those attacked by members of the Axis. The failure to support Ukraine and Israel would encourage Xi Jinping to pursue his Marxist vision, as he put it, of seizing the historical initiative and continuing to move in the right direction revealed by history, and intensify his efforts to better integrate the China dream and the world dream. To me, those phrases echo Imperial Japan's slogan of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a term rolled out the year before the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the initiation of the centripetal offensive across Southeast Asia. So I don't want to be alarmist, but I believe that we are potentially on the cusp of World War III. And if we don't act, I think, in a more resolute manner, I think we will find ourselves in a series of destructive wars that actually place the Ukraine war and the war in the Middle East in a perspective of a much more devastating conflict. So what do we need to prevent, I think, these wars from cascading? Well, I just want to share just a few thoughts about what strategic competence is and how we need to improve it. I'll go through this pretty quickly because I'm very anxious to get to our discussion. But I believe that we are in the situation we're in today because of strategic incompetence. I believe that since the end of the Cold War, our competence has dissipated and has been diminished, largely because of fundamentally flawed assumptions about what the post-Cold War world would be like. And in particular, the idea that ideological competition was over because of our victory in the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Also, a related belief that great power competition and rivalry was kind of a relic of the past. And then the belief, especially after the Gulf War and the lopsided victory there, that our technological prowess, our technological military prowess would just guarantee our security well into the future. And I think we've had plenty of time to realize that those assumptions were flawed. So, hey, it wouldn't be a talk from a washed-up general if you don't quote Karl von Clausewitz, But I think Clausewitz had it right in terms of really the importance of studying history and what he described, as somebody who was in battle at age 14, before he began to really write and think about war and warfare. So he had a practical idea about what combat was like as well. But he said, you study history, you study the past, not to give you like the answer that you need today, but to help educate your mind so you can make a better decision, right? That history doesn't accompany you to the metaphorical battlefield, but in your mind, it helps you make better decisions. I believe that in all the conflicts I just mentioned quickly here, the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict across the Middle East, the potential conflict with China, we've neglected how the recent past produced the present. For example, I think it was quite clear, even, at least from 2007 and his speech in Munich, what Putin's designs were for Ukraine. Became painfully clear in 2014 with the first invasion. It maybe became even clearer and clearer in August of 2021 when he published this long essay saying, Ukraine's not even a thing. It's always been part of the Russian Empire. The same thing, I think, with the conflict in the Middle East. I think you could view the conflict in the Middle East today as part of the 44-year-long proxy war that the Islamic Republic of Iran has been waging against the great Satan, the United States, its Arab neighbors, and what he calls the cancerous boil of Israel. So this is the question I ask students, as we embark on this course on strategy, and I relate the story of walking down Walnut Street in my hometown of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, actually on this weekend, President's Day weekend, on the Friday before President's Weekend in 2017, and my phone ringing and seeing a partially blocked Washington number, asking me if I would go, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House asked me if I would go to Mar-a-Lago to interview for the job as National Security Advisor. I was on the job by Monday. President Trump hired me on Monday, interviewed me the first time Sunday, hired me on Monday. I flew back, and I started work on Tuesday, and I didn't even live in Washington. So there wasn't a whole lot of prep time, but what I was grateful for was the opportunity to read, think, research, and write about history. And I took this understanding of strategy and understanding of of historical examples of policymaking that I thought were fundamentally flawed with me into the job. So I'd like to talk with you really based on these definitions of strategy, essentially, the alignment of ends, ways, and means, and talk really about how we fall into experience pitfalls in our development of strategy and how we can maybe avoid them. So I think one of the biggest problems that we have is we're biased in favor of change instead of continuity. And, hashtag predictable for a historian to say that we don't pay enough attention to history. But I think what because we're captivated by change, we think everything's novel, right? This next conflict will be fundamentally different from all those that have gone before it. Well, that hasn't been the case, right? And I think we saw that certainly with our frustrations in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was our neglect for continuities in the nature of war that I think made those wars more complicated, more costly, and lengthier. We could talk more about that if you'd like. Then I think, of course, the neglect of history. And historians sometimes are the worst about this, right? I mean, we say, you can't apply history to contemporary problems. Well, there's a new movement now in the applied history movement, sort of, is what it's called, that I think helps us use history productively. And I think that the way you can use history is to help you ask the right questions, right? And to help you frame these complex challenges, to understand how the recent past produced the present, to see if there are patterns, or maybe even anticipate pattern breaks that can help you respond more effectively, or better yet, even anticipate challenges and preempt those challenges with an effective approach. But of course, Margaret Macmillan reminds us, that it's pretty easy to shop around for the history you want, and history is prone to abuse, and we have to be cognizant of that as well. So this is one of my favorite people in the world, Zachary Shore. He's a friend of mine and a tremendous historian. And really what he highlights in a number of his works, one of them is called Blunder, Why Smart People Make Bad Decisions, another is called A Sense of the Enemy, is that a lot of our flawed strategies and policy approaches rest on fundamentally flawed assumptions. And what I found when I got to Washington is that many of the policies that had been adopted by previous administrations rested on implicit assumptions. And because they were implicit, they were never challenged, right? That, Iran, having been welcomed in to the international order across multiple administrations, right, would change its behavior. Iran was acting out because we're just so mean to them, This was sort of this underpinned not only the Obama administration's approach to the JCPOA and then the Iran nuclear deal and the Biden administration's resurrection of that flawed approach, but it goes all the way back to the Carter administration. And every president, I think maybe except President Trump, bought into that assumption, an assumption which neglected the role that the ideology of the regime played and the emotions of the leaders in its theocratic dictatorship. So it's important, I think, to understand the emotions and aspirations and ideology that drives and constrains the other. Because of our tendency to kind of mirror image the other, to not think about the ideology that drives and constrains them. Like a lot of times you think, well, that doesn't make sense. Xi Jinping, zero COVID, that didn't make sense. Why do you do that? Why do you crack down the tech sector? Why do you, Well, from our perspective, none of these decisions make sense. From his perspective, of someone who fears the party losing its exclusive grip on power, it makes complete sense, right? So it's important not to mirror image and to guard against optimism, bias, and groupthink as well. Another lesson I brought with me into the job as National Security Advisor was from the book Dereliction of Duty. And in that book, I concluded that there are really 5 main pitfalls in the policymaking process. One of those was they didn't take enough time thinking about the nature of the challenges they faced. The second was there wasn't really a clear objective. Like George Bundy had said, well, it's better not to have an objective in Vietnam, because then if we lose the war, we can say, well, we're trying to do that anyway. We'll give President Johnson more flexibility in the domestic political realm. The third was the degree to which domestic political considerations dominated the decision-making rather than what the real situation was in Vietnam. And the fourth of these was that the president received only one course of action, right? The one he wanted, which is related to the final one of just telling the president what the president wanted to hear. And so I was resolved at least to try not to make the same mistakes as I took over that position. And so what I want to do here is also highlight the risk and cost of inaction. And I believe that one of the reasons why we are in the situation we're in today is the perception of weakness. I think it's the perception of weakness that is provocative. And I think, for example, you can trace the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014 back to the unenforced red line in Syria in 2013 to 2014. I believe that you can trace the reinvasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 back to the disastrous surrender to the Taliban and retreat from Afghanistan in August of 2021. So I think oftentimes we are captured by the risk of action, but don't consider the risks and costs of inaction. And I think we're in that same situation with Iran today, a situation we are with Iran today, because we consistently do not act like we know what the return address is of these attacks in the Middle East. So I'm just going to turn this off, and we just turn this off now. Can we do that? Is it possible? I have some examples here, but I think this is best to go into the discussion. And I think that, just to summarize, the key elements, I think, of strategic competence are to take more time thinking about the nature of the challenges we're facing, to understand in particular the history of those challenges and how they developed, how the recent past produced the present as the first step in making projection into the future. I think it's really important to inventory what your key interests are, to understand what is at stake, why do we care about it, as the first step, and then crafting really clearly understood goals and objectives, right? Because, it's like, otherwise it's like Alice in Wonderland, any path will get you there, so you have to understand what you're trying to achieve. And I think it's also very important to draw out the assumptions on which your planning effort, your strategy is going to be based, especially those involving assumptions involving the degree to which you believe you have agency and influence over this complex problem. And then finally, I think the presentation of multiple options to the president, if you're talking about strategy development at the national level, is extremely important, because it's the president who got elected, right? And the president, should be able to exercise his or her judgment by giving them multiple options. And then also because it's in the presentation of those options and the comparisons between them that you can draw out potential long-term costs and consequences and make a more wise decision. So I know that there's a lot to talk about in terms of the specifics of what's going on in the world today, but I'd really love to hear where my fellow panelists want to take the discussion. And thanks again for the opportunity to be with all of you. Thanks. Thank you. Hi, thanks. Hey, good to be you. Hi, Meredith. Where do you guys want me? Anywhere? Okay. Sure. Doesn't matter.
Well, I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists to you today. First, Meredith Wu is Professor of Practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies and the Office of the University Provost at Arizona State University. She was president of Sweetbriar College and is the former director of the International Higher Education Support Program at the Open Society Foundation in London. Henry Thompson is an associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies here at ASU, where he teaches classes in democratization, international political economy, and social science research design. He's a political economist with a research focus on authoritarian rule and transitions to democracy. And Gary Dirks is Senior Director of the Global Futures Laboratory and Lightworks, an Arizona State University initiative that capitalizes on ASU's strengths in solar energy and other light-inspired research. He's also the Julie Wrigley Chair of Sustainable Practices and a professor of practice in the School of Sustainability and a distinguished sustainability scientist. Before joining ASU, Gary was the president of BP Asia Pacific and then the president of BP China. So thanks to all of them for joining us today. And each panelist will provide some remarks, in discussion with General McMaster's remarks. And let's begin with Meredith.
Great. Can you hear me? No? Oh, I have to turn it on.
Can you hear me? Great. There's a 4-star general I'm honored to call my friend, and his name is David Perkins. And you worked with him at TREDA.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, I did very closely, yeah. And across my career, I've known him for a long time,
Right.
yeah.
And so I called up David when I found out that I was going to be on this panel with General McMaster. And I said, David, what kind of a man is H.R. McMaster? And he said, well, Meredith, he's a good man. He tells it like it is. So I said, great. So then I said, well, I read his books. There are things he says that are important and admirable, but then there are some things that gives me pause, less so. So what do I do? And he said, well, Meredith, you tell it like it is. So there are things in what he said today, as well as what you glean from the books that he's written, that I think are very important, that I want to be careful that I do justice to it. You know, his writings and speakings about strategy, which comes from his understanding, which is profound, because it is his profession, about military strategy, I think is very important. Just as you cannot understand Henry Kissinger without understanding the fact that he studied Metternich and Bismarck and understood, therefore, how you have the kind of peace that prevailed in Europe in the 19th century. Without understanding balance of power, you cannot understand his accomplishment as Secretary of State and as National Security Advisor. And I think by the same token, without understanding the fact that military strategy is mother's milk to him, that he's read military strategy from Thucydides and Sun Tzu to, where is it, Clausewitz, and to asymmetrical irregular warfare, it's something that I think is very important because it brings a perspective that is transferable from military strategy to the thinking about foreign policy. And I think that's very useful. And I want to give you 3 examples of why it is so very useful. One is the recurring theme in his work on strategic narcissism, meaning that we often blunder because we are too narcissistic. We are too self-referential in the way we look at the world. We project our hopes, expectations, and aspirations onto the rest of the world, quite often in an unjustifiable, unrealistic ways. And that narcissism is probably the most serious kind of mental illness we have in foreign policy making. The overt side of that is what he calls strategic empathy. Just as we got a problem for abundance of narcissism, we have a problem for having deficit of strategic empathy, our inability to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. And you know, when I think about how he captured American foreign policy's pitfall by using those expressions, I think about always, as I do, this great line from the great movie Full Metal Jacket, where this Pogue colonel says, as to why we're in Vietnam, he says, well, inside every Viet Cong is a little American trying to get out. That's why we are in Vietnam. And I think that his injunction to be very careful about the pitfall of narcissism and pitfall of not having enough empathy is, I think, a very good one. The other one that I think is very commendable, that comes from his military background, is the emphasis that we often forget on continuity, stability, commitment, and above all, credibility. You know, regardless of what one may think about American role and intervention in the Middle East, I think that we would all agree that the manner in which we left Afghanistan is less than honorable, that we created a catastrophe that didn't need to happen, such as the return of the Taliban. And I have to say that if our policymakers were callous in the way that we left Afghanistan, the people in America were much less callous and in fact did the right thing. This university has taken 135 women from Afghanistan who are stranded on the eve of the encroachment by the Taliban to take over. And we airlifted them in military aircrafts from the airport in Kabul and brought them here. And we have real commitment by people like Pam Delargy and others to really make sure that these women would actually flourish and become accomplished human beings that they're supposed to be. And then we benefit greatly by that commitment that we have shown where our government failed. The third area where I think that his military background is a good antidote to some of the problems we have in foreign policy is his emphasis, because it's all over history of military strategy, is the role of the unexpected, things that are unexpected that happen, and the requirement, therefore, for us to have really clear-eyed view and be agile and flexible so that we can deal with catastrophic turns of events. And this is something that all the way from Thucydides that military strategists have talked about, and or Machiavelli might call it fortuna, or I don't know, our great American philosopher Mike Tyson might have captured when he said, everybody has a plan until he gets punched in the face. So I think these things are very important, and I think that the understanding steeped in military history, I think, is a very, very good way to think about foreign policy because of its transferability. Where I'm not so sure I really understand your perspective really well is how all these things fit together, especially relating to the question of scope of American intervention around the world, scope of our intervention, and how we should be prioritizing our relationship with the rest of the world, and how these battlegrounds that we prioritize are connected together, and where the synergy might be. And that is something that I think that we would need to probe a little bit more. And in that regard, as we think about scope of American interventionism, one can't help but note that if there is any kind of consensus in American policymaking, it is the understanding today that we do not have a consensus on foreign policy. And General McMaster did a piece a couple of years ago for Foreign Affairs where he took on the very wide array of views on what is the proper role of America in the world, and he called it the retrenchment syndrome. Well, I kind of thought, General, it was unfair what you did. And so I did something that many of you do, which is I asked ChatGPT for. I pay $25 a month for ChatGPT that just came out, so I figure I get my money's worth. So I asked, what is retrenchment? And ChatGPT gave me a very good definition of retrenchment, which was primarily financial, but what it said was, it's an inclination to reduce cost by focusing on three objectives. The first is financial stability that's sustainable, and two, to create efficiency, and three, to adapt to changing realities in the world. And if that's retrenchment, I'm thinking that's not a bad way to think about our role and the scope of our intervention around the world. Speaking of stability, I mean, we all agree that there's something problematic with the world, so much so that the lecture today has a title of Global Order with the parenthesis global disorder, right? And so clearly we all agree that we do not have a global order with an underlying assumptions about our place in the sun, our role in the world that we used to have in 1945, and even in 1947 when Cold War got started, and in 1991. We do not have that consensus. And so it is really very good time, whether you are a retrenchment person or not, to really begin thinking about what is that goal, what is the principle that can create for us that stability. And number two, in terms of retrenchment for the sake of efficiency, efficiency to me isn't necessarily even the question of saving money, how to reduce the number of American military bases around the world. 800 might be too much. You might want to move them around and trim a little bit along the way. It's not even about having NATO countries to pay up more. It's not even the question of getting the Japanese to pay 1% of their GDP in military expenditure. I think it is really about efficacy. It is about saving time, life, money, and saving resources, and being very effective while you do so. And finally, one thing the rest of the world, the people that you call retrenchment folks, are thinking about in terms of how to adapt to the changing reality in the world. Well, obviously, the biggest enchilada here is China. And that's a huge topic, and I worry about it. United States never, ever, in the foreign policy establishment, had any kind of credible expertise or knowledge or understanding about China. Part of it is history, because the whole debate about who loves China and China lobby made it impossible for any kind of China expert to be in the State Department. But the other part of it is really, as you said, that we lack in our understanding of China strategic empathy. We have too much narcissism as we think about countries that are posing steep competition for the United States. So we come up with policy proposals ranging all the way from containment industrially, containment politically, containment economically, and containment militarily. Or sometimes, at the other extreme, we just hope that all the nightmare with China will go away and we all go back to making huge amount of money as we did in the 80s or 90s. But somewhere in between, there needs to be a very sophisticated understanding of what ought to be the right shape of the relationship between two great powers, where the peaceful condominium of these two great powers will be the only factor that is truly important for the next generation, the likes of you. And, I think, let me just finish by saying that your predecessor, by half a century, Henry Kissinger, he started in '69, so that makes it about 50 years, right? He turned 100 before he died last year. And in his interview, he was reflecting upon post-war US foreign policy. And he said, the greatest accomplishment in post-war American foreign policy was not in the wars that we fought. It was not in our military interventions, although I might add, maybe Desert Storm was a big exception. But he said where the United States was truly great was in its ability to create prosperity and stability and peace in Europe through Marshall Plan. That was the greatest gift the United States gave to the world, and also to create prosperity and stability in Northeast Asia by supporting Japan and creating a great deal of wealth in countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and all through the Pacific Rim. If we were able in post-war years to create the kind of stability, prosperity, predictability, and great allies with a world order that we could all agree on, I hope that it behooves all of us to begin thinking really creatively about how we can have another period where you can ensure that kind of stability and peace.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you, HR, for your comments. I think actually what I have to say is perfect introduction that you gave there, your concluding remarks about the US-led world order, because in the introduction of your 2020 book, HR Battlegrounds, there's this quote that jumped out at me. You said, "I believe we are at the end of the beginning of a new era," which I think is a Churchill quote, actually.
Yeah.
But the second
Paraphrase,
thing,
yeah.
sorry?
Yeah, I paraphrased it from Churchill, yeah, exactly.
But the other thing that occurred to me is that maybe we're actually in a historically much more threatening time, which is not the beginning of a new era, but a really destructive and dangerous interregnum like we were in the 1930s. And you even, I think, slipped into this analogy yourself as a historian at some point during your remarks. And so I think it's worth probing that theme and asking about that a little bit more. Because the era that we're exiting, I think, or we've already exited, it seems that in maybe 2018 or 19, when you wrote your book, you already had the sense that we were exiting the post-Cold War era, I think was really the culmination of what Meredith was describing, what a lot of us would call the post-World War II liberal era, right? So this era where we had this dense network of international institutions, organizations like the UN trying to structure some sort of collective security apparatus, if deeply flawed. We had the GATT and then the WTO creating very dense trade networks by allowing states to cooperate to reduce their trade barriers. We had more and more coherence around human rights norms, etc. We had globalization, so we had ever deeper ties among nations through flows of trade and investment and intercultural flows, all sorts of things. We also had very promising developments throughout the post-World War II era, if always halting towards decolonization and then democratization, right? We had this very sort of wave-like but spread of democratization, and all these components of what we call the liberal world order seem to be pushing in the same direction of peace. They seem to be pushing in the same direction of prosperity, as Meredith pointed out. A lot of people in international relations theory thought that those institutions would be self-supporting because they were in the interest of states, even if the hegemon, the United States, in the West was no longer there to support these institutions. This is the post-Cold War era that we're exiting now, or have exited, was really the culmination of this post-World War II era, because of course, in the post-World War II era, all of those institutions only operated in the West. In the East, we had a completely different set of institutions under the leadership of the Soviet Union, and to some degree at some times China, that was not part of those institutions at all. And then in 1989, 1991, with the collapse of the communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe and then in the Soviet Union, we had swathes of the world enter into this liberal international order that was led by the United States. That's the era that we're leaving. Now, your book Battlegrounds makes really clear that the post-Cold War era was not entirely peaceful. In fact, you spent your career as a commander fighting in the wars of US hegemony in the post-Cold War era. But we still had this system of liberal institutions, norms, globalization, some flawed, but we thought it was happening, convergence towards democracy around the world, and all these things were supposed to be pushing towards peace and prosperity, and they were supposed to be self-supporting and even self-sustaining. So if that era has collapsed, and I think that your introductory remarks made really clear that I think everyone in this room can sense palpably that that era has come to an end. And some of you are too young to have even really experienced it, but I'm a little older than our undergraduate students, and I experienced it growing up in the 90s and going to university all over the world in the 2000s. And for me, that was some sort of normalcy. But my question to you is, what is the historical analogy, because you made a lot of reference to history in your talk, what is the historical analogy for understanding that transition and move away from a previous order towards a new emergent order where there is more competition with China, more competition with Russia, trade flows are being increasingly disrupted, the WTO is not functioning in the way that it is supposed to be. I could go on and on, right? What is the historical analogy for understanding that transition? Because the historical analogy that we all seem to be grasping towards, and you referenced it yourself, but you can read it in the pages of the newspapers and in magazines all the time, is of the 1930s. not the beginning of a new era, as you put it, but as a much more dangerous interregnum that is not a transition to the post-World War II era. The 1930s were a transition to complete chaos and disorder, and World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust and all the rest. And it is easy to see these parallels, right? In this 1930s interregnum, you had an old sort of imperial order still staggering on under the reluctant leadership of Great Britain and France. Many people would say the analogy is the United States today. Its commitments to this previous order, they're not very strong. The Great Depression caused chaos in the world economy in the late 20s, early 30s. You could draw parallels to the financial crisis of 2008, 2010. You had a rising power, in this case, Germany, but also the Soviet Union, with a lot of economic growth and autocratic political systems. In Germany, you even had the collapse of democracy, which some people see parallels in some of our Western democracies today. And so my question to you is, as a historian who wants our foreign policy decision-making and our understanding of global order to be informed by history, which historical analogy would you turn to if not the 1930s? How can we push back against this extremely bleak analogy that seems to be leading us towards a total conflagration, the worst conflagration imaginable? Is there another historical analogy that you work with or you think people should be working with that's more productive and more positive?
Great. Okay.
First, let me say, General, thank you very much for your thoughtful and thought-provoking remarks, and also for your service. You have served the country during very difficult time periods, under difficult circumstances. I am not a political scientist. I'm a chemist. I'm also not a statesman. I've had no real serious experience in the arenas that my fellow panelists have talked about. So I'm going to be relatively brief, not touching directly on some of the big issues that have been raised here, but more obliquely, and hopefully in a manner that will bring alongside what's been said, my experiences in energy. And I point to energy as perhaps worthy of commenting on in this context, because it is both a source of conflict and an enabler of conflict. And I would give you examples of each, beginning with the United States conflict with the Empire of Japan. Those of you familiar with the run-up to World War II will be aware that the Japanese Empire was expanding in the region, particularly into China. The United States pushed back in multiple ways and ultimately drew a red line. And that red line was, you end this occupation or we are going to stop exporting oil to you, and not just oil, but especially oil. The Empire of Japan did not respond the way the United States had hoped to that red line, and we followed through. We cut off supplies of oil to the empire. I think that took them by surprise because they only had about 90 days of reserves, although they were getting substantial supplies from their occupation in China. Perhaps not entirely unpredictably, they identified another place to go to get oil, which was the South Pacific. But in order to ensure that supply line, it was important to disable the US fleet in the Pacific. And thus we have Pearl Harbor, which was not successful. It was horribly destructive, but it was not successful. The empire then proceeded to the South Pacific, captured oil fields in Indonesia and Borneo, Papua, and that supplied them for a period of time. Now, I'm not a military strategist and wouldn't even pretend in front of a lieutenant general to be one. But it is instructive, I think, that the US began its fight back against the empire by going to the South Pacific and ultimately cutting off that supply of oil to the empire. It's also worth noting that by the end of the war, they could not put ships to sea, nor could they fly planes. Energy is a source of conflict. That's just one of many examples. It's also an enabler. In his remarks, General McMaster mentioned several times Iran. Without a doubt, Iran has used its oil wealth to put itself in a position to be able to engage in conflicts. The same with Russia. Exactly the same with Russia. So, I would like to offer the possibility of a future that might be somewhat brighter if we think thoughtfully about what the future of energy might look like. Now, I'm going to start by saying I've been doing energy now for 49 years, beginning with when I joined the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, which later became BP, as a chemist. I have never seen the energy system as disrupted as it is right now, or as precarious as it is right now. The general's comments about the potential for conflagration in the world is exacerbated, frankly, by the state of the energy system. The system that we have is based fundamentally on fossil fuels. 80% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels, and especially today on oil and gas. And on control of large pools of oil and gas, large reserves of oil and gas, and the ability to transport them from where they are to where they are needed. I would assert to you that this is the result, this system we have is the result of the way in which the superpowers following World War II collided with each other over how you control those resources and how they move. And today, I would argue that the system we have does not serve the interests of the global superpowers. The invasion of the Ukraine by Russia triggered one of the most extraordinary decisions I have ever seen in my lifetime. The decision by the Europeans to cut off gas from Russia. From a national, or in that case, the regional security standpoint, this was an amazing choice to make. 80% of the natural gas that flowed to Europe came from Russia. And they were cut off in the middle of winter. They cut themselves off in the middle of winter. And they had no particularly good reason to believe that it was going to be easy or straightforward to replace those supplies. Now, in what is, again, is an amazing set of events in the energy space, they did replace them, substantially replace them. They found floating regasification terminals, basically regas terminals, and LNG, by the way, is liquefied natural gas, and you must convert it from a liquid to a gas to put it in your pipelines. That's called regasification. They found ships that were basically floating regasification units, got them to Europe, and reprogrammed their supplies of LNG. An extraordinary accomplishment, but fundamentally unstable. Fundamentally unstable because of where they were going to get that gas. Now, I have no idea whether there were any kind of conversations with the United States prior to making this choice, but I have to believe that there were. And I have to believe that there was some sentiment that the US may be able to be of assistance going forward. We are, after all, the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. But in a moment, and I want to say this particularly to my colleagues from ASU, as someone committed to the idea that we must decarbonize the energy system and that climate change is a serious problem. And by the way, the former CEO of BP said that in 1997, that it was going to be a problem. Having said that, emphasizing my commitment to decarbonization, the choice to delay certification of exports of natural gas out of the US Gulf Coast has to have been a devastating message to the Europeans. It's not just the Europeans for which this system does not work. We hear a lot about the Chinese and what they do in the space of energy. And for those of us that are concerned about decarbonization, the headline is always, China is the largest emitter in the world, and look at all the coal they burn. And that's true. They are the largest emitter, and they do burn a lot of coal. They're also the largest importer of oil in the world. They import 12 million barrels a day of oil, 10 million of which goes through the Straits of Malacca, and about 6 million of which goes through the Straits of Hormuz. More comes through the Red Sea. They're also the biggest importer of natural gas in the world, much of which comes from the Soviet Union, from Russia. Now, I appreciate the comments that the general made about this partnership between the Chinese and the Russians. My experience with living with them is this is not a relationship that is based on good, solid historical geopolitics. The Russians and the Chinese have never got on well, except for interludes when they're fighting with the United States. And they cannot possibly feel good about all of the energy they're importing from the Russians, other than the fact that they're getting it cheap. They probably feel pretty good about that, especially oil. But I can't believe that Xi Jinping sees supplies from Russia as being a good thing long term. The system doesn't work particularly well for the Indians either. Again, massive big importers, which means they have very large bills. Their supply lines are somewhat less precarious than what the Chinese are. But when you have a world with the kind of instabilities that we've got, they can't feel good about the fact that they're importing. You could almost make the argument that the system we have works for the United States. We are now the largest producer of oil in history. And as I said earlier, we're the largest exporter of natural gas. We are energy independent, which, as many of you know, at least those of you that aren't undergraduates, it has been a strategic aim of the United States off and on going back 40 years or more to be energy independent. We are now. But unfortunately, and the general alluded to this, we're also schizophrenic. We cannot decide what our energy policy really is. On the one hand, through hydraulic fracturing and the deployment of new technology, we have reached this point of being energy independent, and at the same time, we can't decide whether we're going to support our allies in Europe or not. So, where is the silver lining in all of this? Well, the silver lining is we don't need to stay with the system any longer. If it doesn't work for the superpowers, and if it doesn't work for most of the big economies in the world, then maybe we could think about a different system. And as it turns out, we can, because the reality is now that alternative energy technologies work and their economics are good. Wind and solar are good forms of energy that can be deployable now at scale. When incorporated with batteries and some natural gas. You don't have to get rid of all of it, but just some natural gas. We can build an energy system on renewable energy. There are issues with pace and how fast we can move away from the system that we have. The general's point about continuity is a really, really important one. There cannot be any gaps in provision of energy to the world. He mentioned Russian oil and Russian gas. It's probably worth noting that the exports of Russian oil have not declined at all, as in not at all, in spite of the embargo. I would argue it was never the intention for the Russian exports of oil to decline very much. And there's a very good reason for it. They export 8 million barrels a day. The world uses 100. You cannot take 8% of the supply of oil out of the global economy and expect anything other than chaos. Reducing their realization, reducing the price they get. Now, why emphasize that? Because continuity really, really matters. There cannot be breaks, which means we must deploy new forms of energy without leaving any gaps in our ability to provide the global economy with the energy that it needs. That's not going to be easy, but it is doable. It would be made easier if, as Meredith was suggesting, things weren't quite so tense with the Chinese. And the reason I point to that is because the Chinese produce more of the equipment needed to develop renewable energy assets than the rest of the world combined. They utterly and completely dominate solar panels, wind turbines, batteries. They're the largest electric vehicle manufacturer in the world, and they control about 30 strategic metals that are important for this energy transition. Having lived there for 14 years, I find it distressing that we are where we are. The points that the general made about facts about China are in fact true. They're not particularly new, but they are true. Especially the point about they want to be involved in making the rules. So, the silver lining, the element of hope is we could build a new system that would take conflict over energy and enabling conflict because of energy out of the system, with every region able to use their own energy, produce their own energy. But it probably is going to take some work vis-a-vis the Chinese.
Thank you, Gary. Would you like to reply?
Great, hey, thanks. Thank you. Hey, just some quick responses, because I want to see where we take the conversation from this. First of all, for Meredith, on retrenchment, I think it's easy to imagine, if the United States had withdrawn from other conflicts. You gave the example of the Marshall Plan, but you had to defeat the Nazis before you had the Marshall Plan. Also, I think those who argue for U.S. disengagement from the world are actually profoundly arrogant because they attribute the causes of conflict only to our presence rather than the aspirations of other actors who actually have aspirations that go beyond anything that's in reaction to us. So, for example, I think that the idea that we should have allayed Putin's security concerns and that would have changed his behavior, I think was just naive across multiple administrations, because really what provokes Putin is the perception of weakness and is designed to reestablish the Russian Empire, most recently that he made again in his interview with that useful idiot Tucker Carlson. It makes clear that it didn't matter what we did. He always had his designs on not only Ukraine but also the Baltic states and the other former Soviet republics and the sphere of influence broadly. Of course, we saw that with the invasion of Georgia in 2008. I mean, this was easy to discern. And then also with China as well. I believe that our policy of accommodation with China, real engagement and cooperation with China was misguided, especially in the 2000s after China's entry into the WTO. And it became clear that the assumption that underpinned our approach to China was flawed. And that assumption was that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules. And then as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance. Of course, the opposite has been the case. China wants to pull down the rules as they exist now and replace them with a new order that's more sympathetic to its authoritarian mercantilist model, a model which it is now, as I mentioned with those 4 programs, more aggressively exporting to others. And we could talk more about their strategy and how they're pursuing it. So I do believe that there is a new policy in place for the U.S. government with China that has been the one key element of continuity between the Trump and Biden administrations. And that's the idea of transparent competition with China. And the belief that, that the only way to prevent a conflict with China is to deter it through strength and with capable forward position forces and alliances that can convince the Chinese Communist Party leadership and the PLA leadership that it is unable to accomplish their objectives through the use of force. And this has a lot to do with Japan doubling its defense budget, which it has done, to be spending over 3% of its defense budget of GDP on defense. Taiwan has purchased $19 billion of defense capabilities from the United States. You have new arrangements like the AUKUS arrangement that is designed for deterrence. And so, I believe that the only way to prevent conflict is through deterrence by denial. And in terms of the cost and efficiency, that you would achieve with retrenchment, I think the opposite is the case because it's much cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one. And I think we've learned that in multiple times. In terms of U.S., and I hear the word hegemonic used a lot, I just think we should try to imagine a world in which the U.S. didn't intervene. I really don't think that U.S. lack of restraint has been an issue for the world. If you live south of the 38th parallel, how would you feel about living north of the 30th parallel? I mean, would restraint have been better for the United States in 1950 on the Korean Peninsula? If you're a Bosnian Muslim, you would probably be dead if the United States had been restrained in the 1990s, for example. The other examples that are given for so-called hegemonic interventions are Afghanistan. A war that we entered into only after the mass murder of over 3,000 Americans, right? And then Iraq, you can debate, should we have done it? Of course, that's much debated. Now, I think we ought to debate more who the hell thought it would be easy and why did they think it would be easy? I think you can see, I think if it's quite, fair to criticize the Bush administration for the invasion in 2003, especially because they undervalued the cost and risk of action. I think it's equally fair to criticize the Obama administration for the complete withdrawal from Iraq in December 2010 and their underappreciation of the risk and cost of disengagement, which was not only a military disengagement, but really a diplomatic disengagement that allowed Prime Minister Maliki to steal the election from Iyad Allawi 2009, 2010, and put into place sectarian policies that essentially jump-started ISIS, which is Al-Qaeda in Iraq 2.0, essentially. I think that, you could say restraint was the problem in Syria with the unenforced red line in Syria, after which we invited the Russians, into Syria. How did that work out? And we want to grieve and regret the loss of any life caused by U.S. intervention. But if you look at what Iran has done in the Middle East, there is more blood on the hands of the IRGC than any other actor in history in the region. I mean, again, half the Syrian population is dead, wounded, or displaced, or refugees. So I don't think that U.S. restraint causes problems, and I think that the retrenchers, make arguments for U.S. restraint based on the arrogant assumption that the other only has aspirations and designs and objectives in response to what we do, and I don't think that's the case with certainly with Xi Jinping. The other issue on China, I think, is you often hear, hey, don't force other countries to choose, or we don't want to choose it from the perspective of another country between Beijing and Washington. But if you just look at the behavior and actions of the Chinese Communist Party just in recent years, right? I mean, think about, foisting COVID on the world, persecuting and repressing anyone who tried to ring the alarm bells, doctors and journalists. Think about really then the wolf warrior diplomacy that followed that, adding insult to injury, blaming it on the United States and others and portraying their responses as far superior. But think about in the midst of the pandemic, massive cyber attacks on pharmaceutical companies and research labs around the world. Think about other forms of aggression in terms of economic aggression against Australia for having the temerity to suggest maybe we should try to figure out where this virus came from, or to Estonia for that matter, picking on Estonia. Think about then even the physical aggression that we've seen against our own forces in the South China Sea, but ramming and sinking Vietnamese vessels or Philippine vessels, the threats toward Taiwan or against Japan and Senkakus. How about bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier? How about just what they've done to their own population? Look at the repression of human freedom in Hong Kong, the vast numbers of political prisoners, the most famous of which is Jimmy Lai, but many others. Look at, maybe genocide. Maybe genocide should be an issue we care about against the Uyghurs and forced labor. So all of this is just context for, I think, the need for us to compete with an authoritarian power, a Leninist dictatorship that is hostile to us and is actively undermining us through military action, but also through very sophisticated forms of economic aggression, which include theft of intellectual property, the subsidization of companies that adopt that stolen technology in an effort to close you down in the Chinese market and then dump product on the international market to drive you out of business. This is the case with solar panels, with wind turbines and batteries. It was the case with fifth generation communications hardware. This is the case of Huawei, for example. It's the case with electric cars now, which they are selling at a loss of $35,000 per car to dump them into Europe and elsewhere and to drive others out of business. So I think what we have in place now, finally, is a strategy of transparent competition, but it is imperfectly implemented. And as Gary said, we're way behind. If we learned anything from Ukraine, I think it is that it's a really bad idea to give a hostile authoritarian power, coercive power over your economy. And that's what we've done with China, with all sorts of supply chains and so forth. So that's what would be my response to retrenchment. I don't think retrenchment's the issue. I don't think that restraint would bring us a more peaceful world. I think the opposite would be the case. And with China, I do think there is a strategy in place now. It's imperfect, but it's actually going to continue, I think, into the future and have a lot of continuity between Democratic Party and Republican Party administrations. On the new historical analogy, I'm trying to think of a better one, but it's hard to prove a negative, right? But I think maybe a happier analogy would be the prevention of great power conflict for 75 years or so, based on forward-positioned, capable U.S. forces as part of alliances that, you made kind of the Cold War sound kind of harmonious. It really wasn't, as you know, and we all know. And it was a very dangerous period of time in the Cold War. Well, we prevented great power conflict then, and we can do it now. We kind of know, what the best shot at that is. Deterrence is not foolproof, but it comes from forward position capable forces as part of alliances, really along the rimland at this stage, to prevent war with two revanchist powers that I think are dominating the Eurasian landmass, or want to dominate the Eurasian landmass. In China's case, also to create exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific and rewrite the rules internationally in a way that benefits their model and their interests, and is consistent with their dream and aspirations. So I think that's a good analogy that would be more hopeful. But I do think even World War I might be another sad analogy, and I'm thinking of Margaret Macmillan's essay that she wrote in 2014 called The Rhyme of History. It's on the Brookings website. It's free. It's great. It's brilliant, I think. And it's just a great sort of application of Mackinder and Spikeman, the geostrategic theorists, to the contemporary kind of challenges with Russia and China. And then, Gary, on energy, I couldn't agree with you more that we are engaging in really, I don't know how else to say it, idiotic policy decisions on energy because of our failure to integrate really energy security with national security and efforts to reduce man-made carbon emissions. And if you think about what the Biden administration has done, it has obstructed permitting. Not only has it declared this moratorium on granting new permits, but the permits that have been pending at DOE were slow-rolled by, I would call them, climate ideologues, zealots, I don't know, in the administration, who actually are engaged in behavior that makes it harder to get off of coal, that makes it harder to reduce man-made carbon emissions. And as you mentioned, the largest reduction in man-made carbon emissions in history was associated with the availability of cheap natural gas in the United States. The United States could be the solution to this problem. We could drive the cost of oil and gas down without, I think, jeopardizing and improve the reliability of the global supply market, without jeopardizing the transition to renewables. We could tax the hell out of it ourselves. We could solve our debt crisis that way. And we could invest a lot of these proceeds into newer forms of energy like EM squared fission and other zero emission technologies like hydrogen and so forth. But you need to pair hydrogen with something else, right, to generate the energy. So the solutions are there, I think, from a supply perspective. They're in the United States. We have the solutions. But you know what we do? We shut that. We restrict our capacity, and then we supplicate to the Venezuelans and the Iranians to pump more gas and oil. I mean, it's crazy what we're doing. And by the way, our systems are for extraction and transport are clean. Russia's are not clean. Iran's are not clean. Venezuela's not clean. So if you want to reduce the, I forget what it's called, what's the emissions that happen in the extraction and transmit?
Fugitive emissions.
Fugitive emissions, then go with the U.S. supply and maybe tax or impose tariffs or import duties, if you're Europe and others who are consuming these gas products, on those who don't have clean systems. So there are solutions to that, I think, that would enhance our security, that help lift people out of poverty and generate the energy that is needed, right, to fuel economic growth. But then also pursue policies that as well that make it kind of a false dilemma between having to either restrict economic growth and restrict energy supplies, or continue to warm the climate. I mean, I think what's key is we can develop. States can be the leader in the solutions that are market-based and will be adopted by China, even, or by India, or in Africa, where we really need to make the headway against the future carbon emissions.
Thank you. So before we go to questions from the audience in just one moment, we have so many students here, and I want them to, we talked a little bit ago about one of the one thing what we want to do is for students to go away with a sense of agency, that we can do better in building better futures. And so really quickly, like 30 seconds, let's go down the line and just talk about one sort of positive development that could make a big difference.
Okay, so one big positive development would be to make supply chains more resilient and to find ways, right, to reduce reliance on supply chains that have single points of failure associated with them. We've seen, Phoenix be the place where people are coming to solve one of those key supply chains involving computer chips, microprocessors. But there are other problems, batteries that Gary mentioned. So we need you to help invent some of these new capabilities. Sodium-ion batteries, for example, reduce a lot of reliance on the minerals that we're over-reliant on China-dominated supply chains, for example. Recycling is a huge part of the solution to some of the energy problems, especially those involving batteries and electric cars and so forth. So I just think the big issues in my mind right now are big three, are defense, because we need the capability to deter war and if necessary to fight and win. The second is in energy security, and the third is in supply chain resilience. And I think that's where we really need our scientists and our best innovators and entrepreneurs to go to work right now, because all those are related and interconnected and have a lot to do with whether or not our children and grandchildren will inherit a better world.
Excellent. Meredith?
I think that one thing that could make huge difference in the world is reaffirmation of the United States as a great role model for the rest of the world. And that will entail that we reaffirm our values in democracy, human rights, and all the principles that we hold dear. And it would also require that we get our act together in terms of domestic politics.
Gary?
Well, I'm going to stick with the theme of energy, and I do agree with the comments already made. But I'm going to point to what I think is really limiting the pace at which we can decarbonize the world's economy. And the general mentioned supply chain, that's one of them. A second is the ability to address the very legitimate concerns of local communities as part of the transition, and to build up the capacity for them to bring on stream the kinds of systems and policies they need. And this is a global issue. It is everywhere. Capacity building, capacity building, capacity building, and a just and equitable transition. And that's all about how are we going to do this, young people?
Henry?
I would tell young people and our students to read about the solidarity movement for democracy in Poland in the 1980s and the fall of the communist dictatorship in Poland, because so much of what we talked about here on the podium has been about the challenge of an autocratic regime, communist regime in China, and we assume that that's going to continue for the foreseeable future, maybe even forever. I don't know what the assumption is there, but communist regimes have in the past failed and crumbled, and they have through the extremely brave efforts of people like the independent trade union movement in Poland in the 1980s that challenged the regime, even under military rule and under the most brutal repression, and led to the collapse of the Polish communist dictatorship, and then the collapse of the Eastern European, and then the collapse of the Soviet communist dictatorship. So I think if you want to put yourself in a more positive frame of mind, there's perhaps no more inspiring story to read than that of solidarity in Poland.
Oh, agreed. And you can learn more about it in a course from
You could
Professor
even take one of my classes. But not this year, I'm on sabbatical.
Excellent. So we'll open it up now for questions from the audience, and we'll bring around here we start over here.
George Siddig with Worldwide Cultural Exchange. The murder a few days ago of Alexander Navalny brought back memories of the Cold War, and of course of the tens of millions of people who died in the Gulag Archipelago. The one thing you could say about the Cold War in the United States politics is we did have consensus. There were certain things that we did fundamentally agree on. And the reason my question for you is, Navalny brought up often that success in Ukraine as a democratic and economically successful country would be a symbol for the Russians and would eventually lead to the destruction of the Putin regime. I think that we should listen to him. We are about to embark on spending tens of billions of dollars more in Ukraine. We spent $200 billion already. Is it possible that we can maybe strategically look at an opportunity to invest, to basically declare victory in Ukraine? Meaning this, Putin's claim that he could take over all of Ukraine is an abject failure. The world knows it, Russians know it, he knows it. We're the only ones who don't seem to say it. So part of our victory in the Cold War was based on our getting the message through Radio Free Europe and Voice of America and what was called samizdat in Russian, or self-production of information. In our new information age, is it possible that we could now help build, take the money available, and I think we could get American consensus on this, and rather than continue costing lives of thousands of Ukrainians, help build a new Ukraine and declare victory. And I look back also in my life, I'm old enough to remember when Martin Luther King was assassinated. No political leader wants to be a martyr, but out of his death, Martin Luther King, came motivation for the civil rights movement to succeed. And I think maybe out of Navalny's death, the same could happen in Russia. So it's just proposing, is this I've often been accused of being a Putinite, and I'm the biggest anti-communist you'll ever meet in your entire life. Is it possible that we could rethink what we're doing in Ukraine? Of rebuilding a society rather than continuing military operations? Sorry that was so long.
Hey, I'll just say, and I'll open up to the panel here too, I don't think it's up to us, it's up to really Putin. And he's not going to let up. If you saw the interview he did with Tucker Carlson, and of course you didn't need that to figure it out. I mean, there's no off-ramp for Putin. The only off-ramp for him is an opportunity to look for the next on-ramp. And so the only way for Ukraine to become a secure, viable, prosperous, independent state, or remain an independent state, is going to be to fight to win. I mean, I cannot see a political solution in Ukraine short of one that is permitted because of military success by the Ukrainians, or catastrophic failure and maybe collapse on the part of the Russians, which I think is still feasible. Even though they're Ukrainians, and you're reading more about this now, we're having really a tough time generating more manpower, woman power for their armed forces, and of course this the fecklessness of our House of Representatives and the inability to get an aid package to them is resulting in some ammunition constraints and lack of support that they really need. But I don't think Russia, as you mentioned, can take over all of Ukraine. But what Putin has decided is that if I can't have Ukraine, Ukraine can't have Ukraine either. And so he's continuing the onslaught against the Ukrainian people and their infrastructure, and something has to give to break that stalemate. Now, okay, it's a stalemate, but World War I was a stalemate in 1916. So, I mean, I think that you have to take a long-term view of this. It's also important to recognize this war's already been going on since 2014, right? I mean, this is not something that just started in 2022. And Putin won't stop. He won't stop unless he's defeated. Now, what does that mean? It means providing Ukraine with the capabilities necessary to protect themselves, to protect their infrastructure, and to protect their people. That's long-range precision fires and air defense. You have to be able to kill the archer as well as shoot down the arrows. The other capabilities that they need are the capabilities necessary to sustain an offensive, to build up over time and sustain an offensive operation. That may become more feasible even after Advika, where the Russians had this recent gain control, because they could reach a culminating point again, as they did with the initial attack. I don't think Russia can generate the combat power to take over all of Ukraine. So what we can do is we can support the Ukrainians and provide them, instead of with this halting amount of support, give them everything that they need to accomplish those two tasks, to sustain an offensive and to protect their populations. And I think we could do that. I mean, I really do believe if we provided them with longer range capabilities and greater capacity in some of the areas that we're providing them with, that they could turn the tide. The amount of casualties the Russians have taken is immense, vast. And if you think about really what was happened internally to them as well, I mean, hey, an ex-hot dog salesman, and an ex-convict marched on Moscow, shot down 7 aircraft, took over the equivalent of CENTCOM headquarters. So Putin appears strong, but he's actually, I think, very weak. Now, he's still stronger than any organized opposition. There are more political prisoners in Russia today than there were at the height of the Cold War. He has more people and spends more on internal security than he does on his own armed forces. These are not signs of strength, but I think we could put together a plan to isolate him from sources of strength. Does anybody know who Stephen Cochrane is? I did my impersonation of him at lunch. Okay, can I do an impersonation? He's my colleague. He's the best. He talks with this. He's got this Brooklyn accent, and he says there are 5 things a dictator needs to stay in power. Okay, now stop. So he's like a Joe Pesci voice. He's the best. What are the 5 things that they need? What does Putin need? Cash flow. He needs cash flow. The second thing he needs security forces. He needs the cash flow to pay the security forces, and needs the security forces and the cash flow to keep his Patriots network strong and everything else. The third thing he needs is he needs stories. He needs stories to tell people, hey, I'm the only one who can defend you, from NATO encirclement, from the Nazis in Ukraine, from fill in the blank, right? I'm your protector. The fourth thing, and that gets to your point on information warfare and information operations, to be able to get behind their firewalls. The fourth thing that they need is control over life choices. And then finally, they need an international system that is at least permissive to them, or it doesn't punish them enough. There's more we can do in energy and finance, everything else. So what I would do is put together a plan to go after those 5 sources of strength on Putin, and to get as much international support for that plan as possible. On the information warfare, there's a guy named Vladimir Milov who runs a Telegram channel that I think does pretty good, reaches a lot of people. I think you would try to use Russians help Russians reach their own population about alternatives. Thank you.
Well, if we have one quick question, I think we have time for one quick question before we do over here.
So this is actually a bit of a follow-up question. So I'm Margaret Hansen. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies, and I work on the former Soviet states. And in terms of building the sort of strategic competence and supporting Ukraine in the ways that you've suggested, arguably what is required on the domestic end is a shared perception of danger, of the danger that this poses, both among sort of political elites in power in the US, as well as among voters in the domestic population. But what we're increasingly seeing is a move away from this shared vision of Russia as posing a danger to the US and to our allies. And I'm curious what your ideas are for addressing that, and how you see that affecting the kind of strategic planning that you laid out in your talk.
Yeah. Hey, well, I would just point to what Meredith said about, what you can do to improve, our future. How about getting our own act together, And I think what we've seen is really the failure of leaders at the national level for quite some time to explain to the American people what is at stake in some of these critical competitions internationally, and then also what is a strategy that can achieve a favorable outcome at an acceptable cost and risk. And you'll hear, for example, President Biden will say, and I'm not being partisan or critical because, Trump has his issues too on Russia, obviously, and confronting Putin. But he'll say, as long as it takes, but what is it, And I think that there has to be an effort to define what it is, and then, which I think is a free, independent, secure, a prosperous Ukraine in the future, and then what it takes to do it, and why it's important to us. So it's really, what is at stake is important to explain to the American people. And I don't think we do that very effectively. What also is very disappointing is the degree to which, partisan politics has captured, I think, really critical elements of foreign policy even now. And the degree to which this kind of alt-right group, or whatever you call the kind of people who are representing the narrow majority in the House and exercise control over the House Speaker and what he can bring to the floor, for example. I mean, these are people, these are retrenchers is who they are. I mean, they really believe that the world is a safer place if we withdraw from critical competitions abroad. And so I think that's something else to explain to the American people, is to give examples of how, of how problems that develop abroad can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores. That was the case with Japan, I think, in 1941, for example. I think it's the case with 9/11, right? I mean, that was a problem that when did Osama bin Laden declare war on the United States? 1992? Like, that doesn't really, what does that mean? After the Cole bombing, we fired a few cruise missiles, called it a day, right? How about COVID? Even COVID, I think, is a good analogy for that. If you don't cope with the problem abroad, by the time it reaches your shores, you can only cope with it at an exorbitant cost. And so explaining really the power and the importance of capable forward position military forces, for example, I think is important. So, I think, I think that's what's necessary in Ukraine and I tried to do that in my introductory kind of part of the talk today. I know how effective it is. I'm working on an essay that'll come out, I think, on Tuesday or Wednesday in Newsweek on this. Why should Americans care about Ukraine? How is it connected to these other conflicts?
Excellent. Well, I hope everyone can join us on the atrium afterwards for a reception where we can continue our discussion and questions. Thank you for being here today, and many thanks to General McMaster and our panelists.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.